So, you know that moment when you're reading something in English, maybe an article or even a whole book, and you get it. You feel that little spark like, yes, I understood that.
Hmm.
But then someone asks you about it or you try to explain it, and suddenly it's like trying to grab smoke. The understanding was there, but the words to talk about it just vanish.
Yeah, it's really common actually. And it points to something pretty fundamental about, well, how we learn and use language.
Hmm.
The speaker in our source material, they actually described feeling exactly this after reading a book in their second language.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they grasped maybe 80% of it, which, felt like a huge win.
Right, like a real accomplishment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then found discussing the book to be a surprisingly different hurdle.
Exactly. And that disconnect, that gap between understanding and being able to actually, speak fluently about what you've read, that's what we're diving deep into today. We're exploring how to make your English reading a really active process, one that specifically fuels your spoken fluency, builds your vocabulary in a usable way,
Hmm.
and really solidifies your grasp of grammar.
Right, because as our source makes clear, just passively reading English,
Yeah.
well, on its own, it won't magically unlock your speaking abilities.
Yeah, it's not enough.
That's right. And the source material, it kind of helps us think about this by outlining two main ways we tend to approach reading. First, there's reading for just pure enjoyment.
Okay.
Think about when you're really engrossed in a novel, following the story, connecting with the characters, you're absorbing the language almost without conscious effort, and you probably don't stop at every single unfamiliar word.
It's about getting lost in the story, right?
Yeah.
You might skip over words you don't know and for the general meaning, but the focus is really on the pleasure of reading and the overall understanding.
Exactly. And then the second type of reading, the one we're really focusing on for this deep dive, is reading to learn.
Okay, reading to learn.
This is a much more deliberate and engaged process.
Mm.
It involves actively pausing, making notes, really digging into new vocabulary, the way sentences are put together, and those interesting little expressions that kind of pop up.
So it's a much more analytical way of engaging with the text. You're not just trying to understand the plot or the main idea. You're actively looking at how that information is being conveyed through the specific language choices.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that both kinds of reading have their place,
Yeah.
and they can even complement each other.
Hmm.
You might pick up a lighter book for relaxation, and that's great for just natural exposure. But then a more engaging article or story could also become a fantastic tool for really focused learning. It's about being aware of your goal. Are you reading just for fun, or are you intentionally trying to boost your spoken English?
Okay. So our mission then for this deep dive is to give you some concrete strategies, really actionable steps. We want to help you transform your English reading from that more passive, reception of information into a dynamic engine for building your vocabulary, strengthening your grammar, and ultimately giving you the confidence to speak more fluently.
Absolutely. And the source material offers a lot of practical advice on how to make this shift. It's important to remember, though, you don't need to apply every single one of these techniques every time you read, especially if it's purely for enjoyment.
Right, that would be exhausting.
Exactly. But when you're in that learning mindset, even just incorporating one or two of these can make a noticeable difference. The key is just being intentional about it.
Okay, so where do we even begin? Our source emphasizes the importance of the material itself. It's not just about picking up any English text you can find, is it?
No, that's a really crucial starting point. The source talks about finding that sweet spot material that isn't so easy. You're just skimming familiar words,
Hmm.
but also not so dense that you're constantly, reaching for a dictionary and feeling overwhelmed.
Right, you want to be challenged, but not totally defeated. You don't want to spend more time looking things up than actually engaging with the text itself.
Exactly. The recommendation is to aim for something where you understand around, say, 75% of what's written.
Okay, 75%.
Yeah. That means there's still a good chunk of new vocabulary and potentially more complex sentences to push you, but not so much that it becomes frustrating. That remaining 25%, that's where a lot of the active learning can happen.
That makes a lot of sense. You need that little bit of friction to help you grow, but not so much that you just give up. So once you've found that appropriately challenging material, what's the first active reading strategy we should think about?
Well, the source strongly advises against immediately jumping to a dictionary every time you hit a new word.
Ah, okay. My first instinct usually.
Mine too, sometimes. But instead, it encourages you to become a context detective.
A context detective. I like that.
Yeah, it means really looking at the surrounding words and sentences to try and infer the meaning. Ask yourself, does the context give me a general sense of whether this word is positive or negative? Does it seem to be a thing, an action, or maybe a description?
So it's like solving a mini mystery right there in the sentence. You're using the clues around the unknown word to make an educated guess.
Precisely. The source suggests that this active process, trying to figure out the meaning yourself, helps your brain create stronger connections with the word and its potential meaning. And that's way more effective for remembering it long term than just passively reading a definition.
Hmm.
Plus, this is a skill that's incredibly useful in real conversations, right? Where you often have to understand the general idea, even if you don't know every single word someone uses.
That's a really valuable point. It trains your brain to be more flexible and rely on context, which is so important in real-time communication. Okay, now what about when you encounter those new words and your contextual guess is, well, still just a guess. The source mentions highlighting, but maybe not just that.
Right? Highlighting can feel like you're being active in the moment, can't it?
Yeah, definitely. Makes the page look busy.
Exactly. But the source points out that if you don't go back and actually do something with those highlighted words, they're probably not going to stick in your memory very well. So a more effective approach is to create a more active note-taking system.
Okay.
This could involve, say, circling new words, maybe underlining interesting phrases that sound natural, things you might want to use yourself, or even using a little symbol like an asterisk or something next to grammar structures that you find noteworthy or maybe confusing.
So you're kind of creating your own personalized code or annotation system right there on the page.
Exactly. But the real key is what you do next. The source really emphasizes the importance of taking those marked words, phrases, and grammar points and actually writing them down.
Ah, okay. Physically writing them.
Yes, maybe in a notebook or a dedicated digital document. This act of physically writing, it moves the learning from just recognizing something to actively engaging with it. And this is important. When you do write them down, it's really helpful to include the sentence where you actually found the word or phrase.
Oh, that's a great idea. So you're not just learning a word in isolation, you're seeing it in its natural habitat, understanding how it functions within a complete thought.
Absolutely. So when you later review your notes, you're not just staring at a list of vocabulary out of context. You're seeing real examples of how people actually use English. This helps you remember not just the definition, but also the practical application.
Okay, so we're choosing the right material, we're being context detectives first, and we're actively taking notes, words, phrases, grammar with example sentences. What's another strategy our source recommends?
The next suggestion is a really interesting one. It focuses on engaging with the text even before you really start reading a news section, like the beginning of a chapter.
Before reading, okay.
Yeah. The source suggests taking a moment to predict what you think might happen. You can read the chapter title, maybe quickly scan the first paragraph, and then just pause and ask yourself, okay, what do I think this is going to be about? What events might unfold? Any new characters, maybe?
That's almost like priming your brain, isn't it? You're activating your existing vocabulary and your general knowledge even before you dive deep into the new content.
Precisely. The source notes that this simple habit gives you a chance to even reuse some of the vocabulary you might have learned in previous sections. And then, after you've actually read the chapter, you go back to your initial predictions.
And see how you did.
Yeah. Ask yourself, was I right? What surprised me? What new words or ideas came up? And crucially, can you now summarize what happened in your own words?
That summarizing part seems really key. It forces you to actively process the information and then express it using your own, current language abilities.
It really does. It keeps you actively involved with the material and makes the whole reading experience much more interactive rather than just passively absorbing information. Now, we've talked quite a bit about vocabulary, but the source also offers some valuable insights on how to leverage reading to improve your grammar.
Yes, and it makes a really important point. Knowing the rules of grammar isn't the same as being able to use those rules naturally and automatically when you're speaking.
Exactly. Grammar isn't just a set of abstract rules floating out there. It's also about recognizing patterns in how native speakers actually construct sentences and use language in real life.
Right.
So while you're reading, the source encourages you to actively pay attention to these patterns. Think about how time expressions are used like yesterday, last week, or by the time I finish this book. Notice the words and phrases that connect ideas like however, because, in addition to, or even though. Pay attention to how descriptions are structured. The typical placement of adjectives, for example, or specific phrases used for making comparisons.
So it's about becoming a detective of language patterns, too, consciously noticing the recurring structures and how they function within the text.
Absolutely. And the suggestion, again, is to jot these patterns down in your notebook. By actively documenting them, you'll start to recognize them more intuitively, not just when you're reading, but also in conversations you hear. And eventually, the idea is you'll begin to use them more naturally when you speak, without having to consciously recall a specific grammar rule.
This is all incredibly helpful for building vocabulary and getting a deeper, more practical feel for grammar through reading. But the original issue we started with was that gap between understanding and actually being able to speak fluently. How does our source help bridge that gap?
Right, this is where the source shifts its focus a bit from language input to language output. It provides several very practical strategies to help you take what you're reading and start using it in actual spoken English.
Okay, this is crucial.
The first, and maybe the most straightforward recommendation, is to simply read aloud.
That makes perfect sense. It's a very direct way to engage your vocal cords and, well, practice your pronunciation.
Exactly. Reading aloud doesn't just help with your pronunciation of individual words, but it also improves your rhythm, your intonation, where you naturally pause.
Ah,
It just generally makes you more comfortable with the physical act of speaking English.
yeah, it gets your mouth used to the shapes.
hmm The source suggests starting with shorter passages, maybe even recording yourself, and then listening back to identify areas where you feel you could improve. You can then reread the passage, focusing on those specific sounds or rhythms, and maybe record yourself again.
That feedback loop of speaking and then listening critically to yourself, that seems really valuable for making improvements.
And if you want to take this a step further, the source introduces a technique called shadow reading.
Shadow reading. Okay, tell me more.
This involves listening to an audiobook while simultaneously reading the text and then trying to repeat what the speaker is saying, mimicking their pronunciation, their intonation, their rhythm.
Whoa.
Yeah, there are different levels. You could start just by listening and reading silently, then maybe whispering along, and eventually speaking at full volume, just slightly behind the audio narrator.
Wow, that sounds really intensive, but potentially very effective, like training your brain to process and produce spoken English faster and more naturally.
It is. It really helps you internalize the natural flow and the melody of the language. Now, after you finish reading a section, the source has another key recommendation for turning that reading input into potential spoken output, summarizing what you just read in your own words.
We touched on this earlier with the predictions, but it sounds like it's even more important when the goal is improving speaking skills.
Absolutely. The source suggests specifically reviewing your vocabulary notes from that section and consciously trying to incorporate those new words into your summary.
Actively using the new stuff.
Yes. You could even try explaining what you've read to an imaginary friend or, a real friend who's also learning English without worrying too much about making mistakes. The primary focus at this stage is just on getting your ideas and the new vocabulary out loud.
So it's about actively using the new language, even if it feels a little awkward or challenging at first, getting it out there.
Exactly. Mistakes are a completely natural, even necessary part of the learning process. This stage is all about active practice and refinement over time. And finally, to really solidify your learning and make it more readily available for spoken conversations, the source strongly emphasizes the value of discussing what you're reading with other people.
That makes perfect sense. Actually, having conversation forces you to actively recall information, express your own thoughts and opinions, and respond to others in English, like in real time.
For sure. The source offers several practical ways to do this.
Hmm.
Finding a language exchange partner, maybe actively participating in online language learning forums where you can discuss books or articles, even role-playing scenes from what you've read.
Oh, like acting it out?
Yeah, could be fun.
Hmm.
Or perhaps joining an English language book club. Discussing what you've read not only reinforces your understanding and memory, but also helps you practice using that new vocabulary and grammar in a more natural, communicative setting.
This has been incredibly insightful. So, okay, to really bring it all together, reading for fluency isn't just a passive activity of understanding words on a page. It's about actively engaging with the text through specific strategies.
hmm like trying to guess meaning from context first.
Right, being that context detective.
Taking really purposeful notes, making predictions before you read, and consciously noticing those underlying grammar patterns.
And then, perhaps even more importantly for our goal today, it's about actively finding ways to transform that reading input into spoken English output.
Yeah, through techniques like reading aloud,
Getting comfortable with the sounds.
exploring shadow reading maybe,
Yeah.
summarizing what you've read in your own words, and really engaging in discussions about the material with others.
And the source really hammered home that crucial first step of choosing the right kind of reading material, something that sits right around that 75% comprehension mark. Not too easy, not too hard.
Finding that sweet spot.
Yeah.
Not so easy. You're just breezing through, and definitely not so difficult that it just leads to frustration and giving up.
Right. And it gave us some very concrete, actionable strategies for that active learning phase. Becoming that context detective before hitting the dictionary. Creating a dedicated note-taking system, maybe in a notebook or digitally, with those crucial example sentences.
Yeah, the examples are key.
Making predictions to activate your brain before reading, and actively hunting for those grammar structures as you read.
And then to really bridge that crucial gap to spoken fluency, the key strategies were reading aloud to work on pronunciation and rhythm.
Yeah.
Maybe even trying out shadow reading for a more immersive experience, summarizing what you've read in your own words to activate your vocabulary,
Using the new stuff.
and the really invaluable practice of discussing your reading with others, finding those opportunities for real conversation.
So for you, our listener, really think about this. Which of these strategies feels like the most accessible starting point for you? Will you make a conscious effort next time you read to be more of a context detective? Or will you commit to starting that reading journal, actively noting down new vocabulary and grammar points with examples?
Or perhaps you'll take that first step and just try reading a passage aloud, just hearing your own voice speaking English.
Yeah. Consider how you can actively engage with your next English reading material, not just to understand it, but to truly make it a powerful tool in your ongoing journey towards greater spoken fluency and confidence.